Hey y'all, Jeff here. Um, this is going to be a solo episode today, which means I'm going to talk about some new tools we're working on and share some stuff with you that we've learned in editing sessions and problems we're trying to solve as a community. So before I get to that, though, let me, if you're watching this, I'm going to share my screen. If you're not watching it, I'm just going to talk through it. So we have a big event coming up, a huge event coming up that I'm super excited about. It's happening on January 27th. If you're not watching this on the week that it comes out, it's 2024. January 27th, Saturday, big event coming up. To find it, go to dialoguedoctor.com and then click on the events button in the menu. You'll see the event is The Language of Love, a masterclass on writing intimacy. So this is going to be a 3.5 hour course. It's going to go from 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it is a masterclass on how to write intimate moments in your scene. So moments of vulnerability, moments where the character takes their mask off and reveals who they are, whether that is through physicality, like a sex scene, or whether that is through more verbal, just communication scene where they're talking. Um, it's so important. It's so incredibly important that you hit these scenes right. Um, in order to really take your reader on a powerful emotional experience. So we want to help you do that. Laura, JP, and I have been working on this for a while, trying to decide like, hey, what is it that makes a great vulnerable scene? What is it that really communicates intimacy well? So what we're going to do is we're going to go big to small in this. First, we're going to talk about, for the first hour or so, we're going to talk about how these intimate scenes fit into your plot, where they fall, how to build up to them with other scenes, and how to walk away from them after you have them, so that you get the most power for your punch in that moment of vulnerability from your character. Once we've talked about the big picture of the scenes and kind of how those scenes fall in, we're then going to go into the character build around those scenes. We're going to talk about how voices modulate. We're going to talk about how the characters grow. We're going to talk about in that scene, in that movement, how you can communicate that voice modulation, how you can like tweak the 5 components of that character's voice, really to show and demonstrate vulnerability. And we're also going to talk about the impact of those scenes on the characters when the vulnerability is returned by their partners or when the vulnerability is rejected by their partners. So what does that look like in that scene? What's the experience of the vehicle character in that scene? And then after we talk about that, we're going to get down and dirty into the nitty gritty of the scene itself. We're going to talk about how to build energy in that scene. We're going to talk about how to pull the reader close in that scene and really bring them in. So, and then we're just going to get into like the actual like functioning of like putting the words on the page. What happens when you have a paragraph of prose in one of those scenes? What's that impact on the reader? What is the impact of like a real back and forth dialogue? And then what is it? How does body language and physical communication function as an aspect of each character's voice? So we're getting down and dirty with writing intimacy and expressing character vulnerability. I'd love for you to join us January 27th, 2024. Because I know this is just going to live on the internet forever. 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be on live on Zoom. If you can't make it live, go ahead and still register because everybody's going to get a recording. Everybody that registers is going to get a recording of this course. So if you can't make it live, go ahead and register. And if you're like, you know what, I'll just wait. I'm sure he'll put it up for a discount later. I won't do that. More likely, I will put it in a vault somewhere and it'll just disappear. So we may pull it out in a year or so and do it again. But yeah, don't wait on it hoping it's going to come out on sale. It's not going to happen. So we have other stuff to teach. That's the problem, actually. We have 6 events planned this year. all of the events are different tools and techniques we have heard our community say they need. So yeah, so this is gonna, we've got other stuff to talk about. So if you want to be a part of this, come and jump in. January 27th, live on Zoom. You can register at dialoguedoctor.com or go to dialoguedoctor.teachable.com. You can also find it there. It's The Language of Love, a masterclass on intimacy. Okay. And again, I'd love for you to register for that. I think it's going to be an amazing time. Master classes are some of the favorite things we do that for me. I love doing master classes, and it's not because I just love to talk. Master classes actually are way more interactive and engaging than just me lecturing. If you can come live, there's a lot of Q&A. There's a lot of questioning around, like, how does this work in my specific plot? It's a lot of fun. The live groups are never huge. They're usually like, 10 to 20 people live. A lot of people just get it just registered to get the recording, but I recommend you come live if you can, because it's a lot of fun. So come and join us. We're gonna have a great time. We're gonna discover some stuff together. It's gonna be really fun learning about writing intimacy and vulnerability. Okay, today we're going to talk about something different. Today we're talking about vehicle characters. So let me tell you a story. So we don't build terms and tools at the Dialogue Doctor just to have more terms and tools. I have been accused of that. That is not what we're doing. Because today I'm going to talk about the different types of vehicle characters. This is new stuff. I've only talked about it. I mean, I've talked about it with Laura and JP, but I've only talked about it once before with the community, and that was a couple days ago. The dialoguers, the Patreon subscribers, and I talked through the movie The Godfather together, and we were talking about the cast, and I talked about all the different types of vehicles. It's actually the first time I've unleashed this language onto the community, but I want to talk about it today. But like I was saying, new language, we don't do new language in the Dialogue Doctor community just to have it. What happens, this is the process for developing this kind of stuff. We're working on something together as a community or in editing sessions. And a lot of times we'll be working on something, we see the same problems coming up again and again in an editing session. And we're like, man, the tools that we have right now aren't serving us well, right? I need to put a nut on a bolt and all I have is a hammer, and it's not helpful. So we take a step back and we say, hey, we're seeing a recurring problem. We're seeing a struggle people in the community are having. The tools we have, the language we have isn't working. We need to take a step back and figure this out. And then what happens is I or Laura or JP, whichever one of us is working on the particular problem because we're passionate about it, we go back to what we've read. We go back to the stories we've loved. We go back to the stories we've disliked. We go back to the stories that have connected with us and the ones that haven't. And we start looking for systems that we didn't see, things that existed in those stories that we just haven't labeled, or maybe we look for ways to see the story from a different angle or a different perspective that can help us with our own work. So we go back to master works and other works. I literally will just get a stack of books on my on my desk. And whenever I have a spare like 5 minutes, I'll just start reading through them with a specific question the community is struggling with in mind. So that's how we got to where we are. But let me walk you through the journey. We were having a problem in 2022. The initial problem we encountered was that we'd be trying to talk about story together, either in an editing session or just, amongst the dialoguers would be in the Slack talking about story. And we had these words that weren't serving us well: protagonist, antagonist, villain, hero, ally. The reason they weren't serving us well is because all of those words are event-based. They're words about what's happening in the plot. So the protagonist is the champion of positive movement in the plot, right? The antagonist is the one trying to stop positive movement in the plot. So if the plot is about uncovering a murder, or catching a killer. The protagonist is the detective, and the antagonist is the killer or the people trying to stop the investigation, right? Allies are people that help the detective find the murder. And then um, side characters are characters that just kind of appear and disappear. So you can see how all of that language is events based. Well, what if I told you that the protagonist is the detective, but the detective is really kind of the bad guy in the story, and we want the reader to empathize with and connect to the killer. The killer is the character that we're giving perspective to. The killer is the character that we want to attach ourselves to. Immediately we have a problem because like villain is a weighted word, antagonist is a weighted word. They both mean bad. And so when we're talking about character growth, there's this negative cloud over that character right away. We see this a lot in modern movies in like Malevolent, I can't say it, is the Disney movie with Angelina Jolie, where it's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty. You know what it is. Or in Cruella that just came out, which is a retelling of 101 Dalmatians from Cruella de Vil's perspective. Those are just two examples that come to mind off the top of my head. The idea here is that the villain of the story is the one that we want the reader empathizing with. Or I remember in high school first reading the book Grendel, which is the retelling of the Beowulf saga from the eyes of the monster Grendel. And we want the reader to empathize with and go on a journey with Grendel, even though he's the monster or the villain. Um, so we found ourselves in these editing sessions and in conversations about our stories, just wrapping ourselves in knots, having to explain over and over again. So we said, you know what? We need new words. These words don't work. We need new words when we're talking about how characters function in a cast and how they relate to each other and how they relate to the reader's experience of the story. So in the dialogue community, we started using the word Vea. And I actually didn't use the word Vea. Somebody else used it. And I was like, hey, that does make a word. We started talking about vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards. Um, Vehicles, we said this is the character we want the reader to be on an emotional journey with. So when we say vehicle, we're talking about the character that has perspective, has point of view. We know how this character feels about things, and the reader is ingrained in this character's world. So the reader is on, the story is an emotional journey, and the reader is on that emotional journey through this character's perspective. That character is the vehicle. Engine are characters around it was around the vehicle, but characters in the story that encourage the vehicle to be the best version of themselves. Because if the reader is on an emotional journey with the vehicle, what makes the reader happy, what delights the reader is the vehicle growing and changing in positive ways, right? We don't care what the plot is. We don't care where the story is going. If the vehicle is a killer or a detective, it doesn't matter. What we want is the vehicle growing and changing in positive ways, and we can connect to the story. So hero arcs, the vehicle grows and changes in a positive way. Tragedy arcs, the vehicle fails to grow or changes in a negative way, and that creates a tragedy. Engines empower the vehicle to grow in positive ways, either by representing those positive traits to the vehicle or by bringing those positive traits out of the vehicle, either by challenging the vehicle or encouraging the vehicle. But engines encourage positive growth. Anchors pull the vehicle down and they bring about negative growth. So you've probably heard me talk on the podcast with authors because we did it this year for dialoguers. We read the book by Angie Thomas, The Hate You Give, and the main character Star has two friends at school. Right. One of these friends is an engine. She's encouraging Star all the time to be the best version of herself and to find her voice. That's what we want Star to do, to grow into her voice and to find the courage to speak about her experience. So when Star finally does that at the end of the story, we get this giant surge of excitement because Star takes to the top of a car and finally speaks her story and her narrative into the world. It's a huge growth moment. As the reader, we love it and we get pumped. There's a character that encourages Star to speak. There's also a character who is Star's friend, who in the plot would be considered an ally of Star, but who pushes Star down and communicates to Star that she should not change and she should not speak, and her perspective is potentially wrong. So that character that pushes Star down is an anchor, even though that character is a friend and an ally, not a villain. So you can see why this language helps us engage in our story in a different way. Vehicles carry the story, engines encourage the vehicle to be the best version of themselves, anchors encourage the vehicle to be the worst version of themselves, and then hazard characters are characters that appear only occasionally in the story, and we want to make them big. They force the vehicle by the sheer force of their personality to swerve. The vehicle has to make choices and respond to hazard characters. So these terms helped us put our character growth at the center of the story. They helped us solve that initial problem of language. But when we started using these as a community, we found that there were some fun side effects to discussing story in this way that we weren't planning for. We were really just looking for ways to talk about how our characters relate to one another. But we started plotting character growth with these words. We started to say like, oh, so I can identify the vehicle in my story. And once I know who the vehicle in my story is, I can actually chart out the vehicle's character growth, and I can start writing scenes toward that character growth. I can say, okay, here's the choice my character is going to make. Here's the consequence of that choice, right? Here's the challenge to my character. Here's the choice my character is going to make. Here's the consequence to that choice based in this scene. And is that consequence a positive or negative consequence? Once we recognized who our vehicles were, and that it didn't matter if they were the protagonist or the antagonist, that what mattered about the scene is how the choice the vehicle's making and how the vehicle feels about that choice after, we were able to start plotting out like, hey, this is cool. We can look at a story as a journey of character growth. Start building out unintended consequence. You've probably seen me do this with writers on this podcast. You've probably heard me go, okay, who's your character at the start of the story? Who's your character at the end of the story? What steps of change are we taking to get there? That's a byproduct of this VEA type approach to characterization. Another byproduct is we can start taking really complex casts that we love, and we can start asking the question, who's an engine and who's an anchor to each other? So this is a chart that the dialoguers and I used to graph out. We did a Zoom together where we graphed out how the different characters of the Guardians of the Galaxy operate together. If you're not looking at the screen, you're just listening to this, I have that chart up, and you can't actually read it. It's just this is an example of what I'm about to talk about. So what we found we could do once we started understanding that characters were engines or anchors to each other, regardless of whether they were villains or heroes, we started to be able to go, okay, if this character is an anchor to my vehicle, and I want in this moment of the story for the reader to feel sad, then I should write the scene with an anchor in it to drag my vehicle down. Or if I want the reader to feel victorious in this moment, I now have a new tool. I know I have this anchor. I need my vehicle in this scene to reject the anchor, and that's going to give the reader a sense of victory, because the vehicle is rejecting negative influences. So the reader is going to feel excited about what's happening in the story. So this language, vehicle, engine, anchor, and hazard, provided us new ways to start to manipulate our story at the scene level, to be like, okay, I know that I need a down moment here. I'm following the hero's journey with my vehicle. This is the dark night of the soul. How do I get a dark night of the soul? My vehicle needs to fail to change. They need to change in a negative way that makes the reader feel sad, so the vehicle feels lost. right? So I need an engine that is rejected. I need an anchor that is accepted in this moment, right? Because it's the interrelation between the characters, the dialogue between the characters that drive our story. All right. So this is all where we were. And then this year, we did something new. In the fall, we did the Dialogue Dash. And the Dialogue Dash was a new program for us. It was 80 days. We had about 100 writers participate, which was astounding. We did 30 days of planning, we did 30 days of writing, and then we did some time talking about editing our work. And it was amazing. It was really, really great. But this conversation we've been having about vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards, it all kind of assumes a single vehicle. We didn't realize that until we got into the dash, and people were like, I think I have 7 vehicles. And we're like, what are you talking about? And then as we talked to them, we're like, oh my gosh, you do. You have all these different perspectives. You have all these different point of views. You have this epic cast that's built out, all these different vehicles. So we said, we're like, okay, how do we know when a character is a vehicle or a character is not a vehicle? How do we make that decision? And then how do we plot for character growth when we have multiple vehicles? That's actually a 2-part question. The first part is understanding the type of vehicle you have. The second part is then once you know what kinds of vehicles you have, how do you use those vehicles in a plot? I'm only going to answer the first of those questions tonight, or this would be like 15 hours long. So maybe I'll give you the second answer later. So tonight we're going to focus on what is a vehicle? How do we know when we have a vehicle character, especially if we're writing multiple vehicle plots? And then we're going to talk about the different types of vehicles and how we know they need to be used as we're kind of developing our plot or writing our story or editing our story. Okay. It's time. We've run into a new problem, a problem we don't have the language or tools to fix. So it's time for some new terms and for some new stuff. I hope some of y'all get excited about this. If you hear me go, it's time for new terms, and you're like, ah, then just listen and take what you can get out of this. Do not feel pressure, right? These are tools for you to use. You do not have to use these to write a great story. You do not need to use these to write a great story. If you feel stuck, if you don't know where you're going, if you feel trapped, if you can't get the story in your head out, maybe these tools will help you. Maybe. That's always the goal. The tool is to be used when something needs to be fixed or built, not just used all the time to use, right? Like, and not using a tool when you don't need it is wonderful, right? Like, if you don't need the tool, put it down. If it's not helpful, it's not working, don't use it. But at the same time, I'm a constant learner. I'm obsessed with learning. I want to master all of the tools I can so that when I get stuck in a plot, I can use those tools. So, for example, I right now have in my head, I have other work I have to do this year. I've got so many books I got to write this year. But once I get clear of the books that I feel obligated to write, I have a book in my head. I think I've talked about it on the podcast before that has 5 vehicles in it, 5 characters. They're all going to get point of view and perspective. And one of them is this overarching narrator, who I'm really excited about writing his voice because he's an AI. Who is like watching the story happen, and he's very cynical and snarky, and likes being behind the scenes, and has lots of philosophical conversations about has he reached God's status yet, with a little bit of joy of how uncomfortable that conversation makes the reader. So I'm all excited about it. I'm like a year and a half away from writing that. So anyway, all that to say, um, I don't know how to lay. I didn't until I started working on these problems. I didn't really have the tools to talk about how that vehicle grows or what my expectations when I write and edit that character should be for to create a satisfying and fulfilling story for the reader. I wasn't sure how those vehicles should interact with each other. So all that to say, new terms are meant. So I needed new tools, right? Like new terms are meant. When we were doing the dash, we encountered all kinds of writers who were like, I have these so many vehicles, there's this one scene, I have to put it in this character's perspective. I have to, but I'm only going to give that character one scene. All of my red flags went off because I was like, no, 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 do not put us in a character's perspective. Do not make us empathize with a character unless we're going to have some kind of growth arc. Um, because then the reader's going to be irritated that they had to spend time with that character. They're going to be confused. They're going to be like, why did we do that? That doesn't make any sense. And I don't really care about that character. This chapter is boring, right? Like, so, yeah, all of those red flags came up, but I realized we didn't have the tools to actually fix them. So we're building new tools. My little rant again is to say, if this overwhelms you, just listen and enjoy it and don't feel the need to use any of these. If you're stuck, you feel like you need to fix something, you feel like you're writing a plot, it feels out of control, you don't really know what's going on with it, maybe these tools will help you. So all about vehicles today. What makes a vehicle? A character is a vehicle when the reader feels the story from their perspective. So if you're writing first person POV, your first person POV is your vehicle. If you're writing third person close, meaning that it's a third person style, he, she, they, it, language, then the vehicle is the one whose thoughts and feelings you're constantly giving us in the prose, right? So the classic example we've been using in the Dialogue Doctor community, because it's such an amazing book, is TJ Klune's The House of the Cerulean Sea. Linus is the vehicle, right? Every scene, even though it's third person, every scene we're getting his perspective. It's his perspective that we feel the story through. So the vehicle is when the reader feels a story from the perspective, and it is pretty easy to be like, okay, whose perspective is this scene through? It does get complicated sometimes, and we're going to talk about that. How does it get complicated? Because, like, the book thief, for example, Death narrates the story. Is Death the vehicle? He is. He's one of them. Even though we feel the story through other characters as well, Death is definitely a vehicle, and we have to think about the narrator's growth arc and how the reader interacts with that character, how the reader sympathizes with that perspective. By the way, all this conversation about perspective, this is what led us to the masterclass on intimacy, because we realized that, like, look, intimate and vulnerable moments are actually all about character perspective. They're like deep, deep into character perspective. So character perspective is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about on January 27th. I hope you will join us. Go to dialoguedoctor.com to register. All right, this is enough of the commercial. Okay, so yeah, so are all vehicles created equal? If you're writing a multi-vehicle story, let's say that you are an aspiring Tolkien and you have some hobbits running to Mordor with a ring, and you have Strider and an elf and a dwarf running all over the countryside trying to get Strider to gain the confidence to become Aragon and ascend to the throne, reborn as he raises the army, the dead army, he resurrects them to come to battle. And you have Merry and Pippin getting lost and drug around by orcs, and then finding the Ents and having their own battles, right? Like, you've got all of these vehicles. Are all of those vehicles created equal? Do they all have to be treated with the same amount of care? Do you need huge growth arcs for all of them? Do they all need the same amount of scenes? How does this multi-vehicle stuff work? As I've been reading and looking at different stories and talking to authors in editing sessions, I've found that there are 5 kinds of vehicles, and each vehicle gets treated a little bit differently. Now, some of these vehicles only work in multi-vehicle plots, meaning you've got more than one vehicle in the story. some of these vehicles work. The lead vehicles can be in their own story. So we're going to talk about that some, but the fight. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Um, Jeff talks in circles. What are you talking about? Jeff talks in the third person. So weird. Um, Not a vehicle you can empathize with. I'll tell you that. Anyway, so five kinds of vehicles. This is the problem with solo episodes, is that I just start talking to myself. All right, five kinds of vehicles. I work better with a team, people. Um, Number one is lead vehicles. Number two is supporting vehicles. Number three is third party vehicles. Number four is chorus vehicles, which this one really pushed me. And then number five is Messiah vehicles. So we're going to go through all of these together. Um, Let's start with lead vehicles because these are the most important, I think, to our writing. If you're writing a classic single vehicle story like The House on the Cerulean Sea that I mentioned earlier, there's just one vehicle. Friedrich Bachmann wrote A Man Called Ove. I love that story. All scenes are in Ove's perspective. So amazing. A story. One of my favorite books of the last couple of years, but all the scenes are in Ove's perspective. We never leave O's perspective. He is in and behind every scene. Um, right now, I'm reading Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief to my 9-year-old. He's absolutely loving it. Beautiful series by Rick Riordan. Great job. It's all in Percy's perspective. The whole book, Percy is in every scene and behind every scene. We never leave Percy's perspective. This is your classic lead vehicle. I would say, just from my experience, 70% of the stories written are single vehicle, lead vehicle stories. We get behind one perspective and we just go with it. Now, it's interesting, Rick Riordan's books, this is just an aside, they start with a single lead vehicle. And then as the story grows, they move into multiple vehicles. And you get his books later where the vehicle is actually listed as the chapter title. It'll be like Annabeth is like the top of the chapter. And we know, like, oh, I'm in Annabeth's perspective. Grover, I'm in Grover's perspective. I actually don't know if Grover ever gets a perspective. It may only be his demigods that get perspectives. I'll have to go back and look at that. But you can have multiple lead vehicles in a story, right? Like I just described with the Tolkien story, Strider / Aragon is clearly a vehicle. He has his own story. We see a lot of the story in his perspective. We follow his perspective, especially in the second and the third book. Um, Frodo is a vehicle, right? We follow Frodo's perspective. We don't get a scene in Sam's perspective. I don't think. Maybe we do actually, because there's a scene where Frodo goes down. Oh crap, I might have to go back and look at that again. Sam might be a supporting vehicle, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Frodo is definitely a lead vehicle. We get a large amount of the story in Frodo's perspective. Game of Thrones, another example of, or the Song of Fire and Ice, if you read the books, if you're a purist and you're going to be a nerd about it and a huge jerk, you're like, I didn't watch the HBO series. I read the books. That was me. Thank you. I'm owning that. I'm not making fun of anybody. I'm saying that is what I'm going to do today. I read the books. I didn't watch the movies. If you read the books, probably in the movies too. I don't know. I didn't watch them because I read the books. Uh, so far off the rails. So again, multiple vehicles. We're following Arya Stark's uh, um, journey. We're following Bran Stark's journey. We've got multiple lead vehicles. So, what makes a story a lead vehicle, and what's required of a lead vehicle? Story is, and again, these are important because this is the vehicle you're going to write the most. Their story is the emotional journey. So the reader's attaching to their story and following their story, which means if you want a complex and fulfilling story, this character needs a complex growth arc, right? We need to see them struggle to grow. We need to know, who are they at the beginning of the story? Who are they going to be at the end of the story? And then getting to who they're going to be at the end of the story needs to be a struggle, needs to be some kind of fight to get there. So, and we need to be afraid that they're actually not going to make it. So their story is the emotional journey, and that journey needs to be a complex growth arc. They need to be the major POV character. So we should live the story through their heads. They can't be a lead vehicle if they're only showing up for one or two scenes, right? If you got a 40 scene story and a character's only showing up for one or two scenes, they're not the lead vehicle. Your reader is connecting to somebody else. right? Like, so there's whoever's in the other 38. So your lead vehicles need to have a healthy amount of scenes so that the reader can get used to empathizing and living inside their heads. And then finally, by the end of the story, they should be changed. Stories without a lead, with vehicles that don't change are going to feel flat. Now, I'm going to caveat that and say we're going to talk about Messiah vehicles at the end, which I have apologies to make. They are vehicles that don't change. Pausing for people I've had editing sessions with that have fought me on this, and I have refused to admit that vehicles don't change. Pausing to allow you to applaud um, yourselves for winning this argument. Anyway, but you're not going to like what I say. So So, but lead vehicles, your traditional vehicle in a story needs to change. We need either a victorious change where they become a better version of themselves. That's going to feel like a victory to the reader. A tragedy or a sad story is where they fail to change in a positive way. It's going to feel like a tragedy to the reader. So, how your vehicle changes in a positive way or a negative way is going to determine how your reader feels about the story. Um, Lead vehicles, again, this is what we're used to when we think of like a perspective POV main character. We're typically thinking about a lead vehicle. But what if you have a character and they have their own scenes, but they only have, like, in a 50 scene book, they only have like 3 scenes. That's it. They're just showing up for a minute, right? um we only see their perspective a little bit. So, like, we were talking about the dialogues, and I said we just met and talked about the screenplay and movie The Godfather by Mario Puzo, and oh, the name of the director and writer is slipping my mind, Francis Ford Coppola. um Connie Corleone is a character in the first movie. She's in 3 scenes. There's 3 scenes that she's in. 2 of them are from her perspective, right? Or there's 4 scenes that she's in. There's 4 scenes she's in. 2 of them are her perspective. We see her wedding. The wedding actually has all of the vehicles in it. There's 7 different vehicles in that movie, right? The wedding has all of the vehicles in it. And there is a heartbeat in the vehicle scene from her perspective where she's putting money in a purse. And then she comes back later as the vehicle of the scene when she's being abused by her husband for the first time. We see that from her perspective. We see her get abused by her husband again from her perspective. And then the final scene starts from her perspective. The final scene of The Godfather starts from her perspective. She bursts into the house screaming at Michael. So she is not a lead vehicle in that story. She's a supporting vehicle at best. She's got 4 scenes. There's not a lot of growth range. Now, in the later movies, the later stories, she becomes a lead vehicle. But in that first story, it's hard to say she's a lead vehicle, and we don't want to treat her like a lead vehicle. We don't want to develop a complex growth arc for her, right? Because she's just not in enough scenes. But the truth is, to make the plot work, to make the story work, we had to put a couple scenes in her perspective. We had to see the abuse scenes from her perspective to make it work, right? So we've got this second type of vehicle that Connie Corleone fits that's called a supporting vehicle. You get a lot of these in, like, these large epic stories that have these giant casts. These are characters that, for the sake of the story, are going to need to have some scenes in their perspective. So they are a vehicle, and we do want our reader to have a satisfying emotional experience with them, but we don't want to build an entire story around them. So it is tempting. Let's talk about what a supporting vehicle is. It's like I'm saying, it's tempting to only use them in a single scene. It's tempting to be like, okay, I'm going to have this one-off scene in this character's perspective. The problem with that is the reader will get frustrated because the reader's like, I don't know why we're here. I don't know why I'm in this character's eyes. A good developmental editor is going to read that scene and be like, cut it, put it in the main character's eyes, because we're going off in this offshoot in this other character's eyes. We don't need it. It feels like a distraction from the main story. So, um, if you're going to do this, if you're going to have like one or two scenes like a Connie Corleone in that character's eyes, they have to have a full growth arc, meaning they have to have a start here and end there. You have to be able to say the character starts here and ends there. Connie Corleone starts in a deep excitement and joy in what she thinks is obtaining her full role in the family. She ends beaten and devastated, right? Emotionally and physically devastated by the end of the story. So we have a start here and an end here for her. We don't just see her in one scene, start and end. So they're going to need, your supporting vehicles are going to need at least two scenes, because we have to see them initially and then the conflict, and then we need to see the choice they make and the consequences, using three-story method language of every story needs conflict, choice, and consequences. If you put us behind a character's eyes, we have to see the conflict, we have to see the choice, we have to see the consequences. You can do that in two scenes, especially if the consequences happen in another vehicle's eyes, right? So, but we're going to need at least two scenes for every supporting vehicle. So just know, if you're bringing in supporting vehicles left and right, you can't just drop them in, put us in their perspective, and then get us out of there. We're going to need at least two scenes in their perspective. We got to see what's happening. When we see what's happening through their eyes, we need to see it to conclusion. We need to start here and end here. Change for these characters will be small. It doesn't need to be complex like your lead vehicle, because we're just with them for a moment. So it can be as simple as like a single moment of courage, or a single moment, a single decision where they decide to do something, or a single experience where they experience something that changes them. So that's a supporting journey, a supporting vehicle character. Is this side character, side vehicle who is only showing up for a couple scenes. Now, they may be in the background a lot of the book, but we're talking about scenes in their perspective. They're only showing up for a few scenes in their perspective. Yeah. Next type of vehicle. So we've got our lead vehicles, we've got our supporting vehicles. Again, most of the time, those are the two you're going to use. Those are the two types of vehicles you're going to jump into. And again, they have a little bit different rules. Lead vehicles need to be complex. We need a healthy emotional story arc. We need to really live into their eyes, lots of scenes. Supporting vehicles, you can have like one or two scenes. They do need simple change, right? You can't just have one scene. They do have to have simple change. We need to see the conflict, choice, and consequence of their story arc and how they're changed by that experience. Next type of vehicle is a third party vehicle. So, like I mentioned before, this would be like Death from The Book Thief, right? This is the narrator that sits on top of the story and tells us the story. I've read several Elizabeth Gilbert novels with this type of character, where they sit on top of the story and they tell us the story as the narrator. So they are a vehicle. This third party character is a vehicle. This third party narrator is a vehicle. And the reason they're a vehicle is because they interpret the emotional journey of other characters for the reader. So the reader is in the narrator's perspective, right? They bring that perspective and thus influence the reader, and thus they are manipulating the emotional journey. So we have to treat them like a vehicle. Here's the catch about these third party vehicles: often when they're written, they have already been changed by the story, which is why they're telling it. So that narrator voice is like, hey, I've seen this thing. This thing has moved me and shaped me, and this is why I'm telling it. So in these third party vehicles, you're often seeing the story, an ending version of them, especially if this is a vehicle that's telling a story that they are a part of. Right. So a lot of techniques I've seen is where this third party vehicle is talking about what happened in their own life. And you have a mature version of this character talking about what happened. And they are a character in that narrative. When that happens, we need to make sure that their voice is more mature and is changed from the character we're seeing in the story. right? So growth arc is still important here. We're just catching them at the end, which means to give your reader a satisfying experience with this third party vehicle, because remember, readers are coming for the emotional journey and change. The trick to these is that you're starting at the end of the journey. You have to explain to us through the third party vehicle's eyes what their change has been and how they've been changed by the story. Going back again, just off the top of my head, to the book Thief's Character of Death, he talks about how these characters that he's following have changed him. He talks about how he is usually this kind of like sanitation worker of life where he's picking up um after the dead, after wars, and usually he doesn't even notice humanity, but these characters he's noticed. He's talking about these people have changed me, and therefore I'm bringing them to you and offering them to you. So we need to understand this third party narrator needs to reflect on the growth that they have had through the encounter of these other characters, right? That makes this third party narrator a living, breathing entity to our reader, and it allows our reader to connect with them in kind of magical ways. So third party, we've got lead vehicles, which is our traditional type of vehicle we're writing. We've got supporting vehicles, which are these kind of, I have to use this person in this plot, but we need to make sure that we're giving them full growth arcs, even though those growth arcs are simple and small. And then we've got third party vehicles that are looking down at the story, have already completed their growth arc, but we need to make sure as we're going on this emotional journey that they're reflecting on how they've changed through the experience of this story. Okay. This is wild. All right. So I'm laughing at myself. I'm like, this is a lot. Uh, Fourth type of vehicle are chorus vehicles. These are always supporting vehicles. I haven't found a book yet, and I've been looking and been asking other readers. I haven't found a book yet that has a chorus vehicle at the heart of the book. These tend to be supporting vehicles, but they're treated a little bit differently. So my first engagement with these, I was reading the Aaron Sorkin screenplay, The Social Network, and there's three characters in there that operate as a chorus. So remember in dialogue, Dr. Language, when we talk about chorus, we talk about characters, a group of characters that operate with a single voice. The characters are multiple people, but they speak as one and they act as one character in the narrative. So choruses can be vehicles. And in that movie, in that screenplay, The Social Network, you have the Winklevoss twins and their friend, whose name I always forget. Please don't ever listen to this because he's like an actual billionaire. But what happened to the dialogue doctor? It was crushed by a billionaire because Jeff couldn't remember his name in a weird solo episode he was doing. So sorry. Um, yeah. Where was I? Oh, chorus vehicles. So those three characters in the plot have a unified growth arc. They are interchangeable. You can pull them out, any one of those three at any moment, and put the other one in, and it doesn't matter because they operate as a single voice, right? They're supporting characters. I think if I'm remembering right, there's three scenes from their perspective. There's a scene where they're talking about Zuckerberg. There's a scene later where they are angry and trying to decide what to do about Zuckerberg. Sorry, that's the first thing I'm thinking about. There's a scene because they meet Zuckerberg, but that's all from Zuckerberg's perspective, from Jesse Eisenberg's perspective. But then there's a scene where they are in a room alone talking about how they feel like Jesse Eisenberg's character has wronged them. There's a scene where they're rowing in England and they learn of the progress of Facebook and they're really upset about it. And then there's a scene where one of them is at a dinner and he discovers something. He goes running out of the dinner. Those are the scenes where they are the vehicle. We're in their perspective. Again, supporting vehicles. They're just in the plot to kind of move the plot along, but they do have a growth arc, right? We see these characters change and grow. They move from entitled empowerment to disenfranchised and shut out. And so they have a simple growth arc where they move through. So the scenes from these characters, it's super important. You cannot differentiate these characters from each other. They all have to be growing in the same ways at the same time, right? You can't pull them apart, because once you pull them apart, if one of them is growing a little bit different than the other ones, then what you have are three supporting vehicles, not a chorus vehicle. To keep them as a chorus, they have to move in unison because they're interchangeable for each other. It doesn't matter which one of them they have. A lot of times, like, I'm trying to think if we get a scene from their perspective. It's been a long time since I read the books, but since we talked about Fire and Ice, there are several choruses in Fire and Ice, like the people of different realms. That I think specifically of, like, the characters on the wall. There's several choruses on the wall. I'm not sure if we ever get a scene from their perspective, but we might. I'd have to go back and look. But if there is one, that would be an example of how you use a chorus, where you've got kind of a group of people that's led by a single person, but they all are kind of the same mob character. Having a scene in their perspective would give you that kind of chorus. But remember, if you give them one scene, I'm going to ask you for two, because we need to see the start and the end of where they go. At least two. Yeah, so that's chorus vehicles. I think I've beat that one to death. Last one, Messiah vehicles. And this is where I owe some people an apology. I fought you very hard on saying vehicles always change. I went back to my reading. I had to go back to my Christian read, my evangelical days when I was a teenager, reading like Frank Peretti novels and like Christian novels. There are Messiah vehicles in those novels. So let's talk about what an Messiah. And I might relent. I have specifically fought several of you on this. You've been like, what about Jack Reacher and Lee Child novels? He never changes. And I've been like, he does change. He just starts and ends at the same place. Um, I relent and I apologize. I'm not sure that that's true. Let's talk. And thinking about, I've only read a couple of those books. People who have read all of them can tell me more, can confirm or deny this, but I'm just going to float the theory. Because remember, these are tools. If they're not helpful, don't use them. But Messiah vehicles. This vehicle is the personification of a worldview the book is championing. So when I think back to the literature that the Christian literature, evangelical literature I read as a teenager, there were books. I can think of one book specifically. I think it was called Joshua, where the character, the vehicle we're following, is already perfect when they show up on this scene. They are a perfect representation of the worldview. In those evangelical books, they were the perfect evangelical character. And they're the personification of the value system and the perspective that the author wants the reader to engage with. So the character doesn't have anywhere to grow or change. The character might feel things. The character is going to have different perspectives. The character is going to be challenged and make choices, but the choices are always the perfect choices to be made, and they stem directly out of who the character is. So the point of this vehicle character is not that the character changes, but that the world around the character is forced to reckon with the perfection of this character and the worldview this character personifies. The emotional journey of these characters becomes a celebration of the worldview, right? So we have this character that's unchanging. As they're unchanging, the reader is celebrating because the unchanging worldview always defeats the character. Now, I mentioned Jack Reacher. I just watched the Amazon show. I haven't read the book that one's connected to. I've read three Jack Reacher books by Lee Child, and he's the one that people always hold up as like, this character is unchanging. I can see him as a Messiah vehicle, in that he represents a version of masculinity that solves problems with reluctant violence, um, that and is connected to American militarism, um, that he is a champion of. I was talking to one of my brother-in-laws a little bit about this, who's a huge Lee Child fan and reads all of the books. And I was asking him about the Jack Reacher character, and he's kind of what I was describing earlier as a comfort reader. He likes the same He likes to read the same story over and over, and it gives him comfort. And part of what he likes about Reacher is that he always knows exactly what Reacher is going to do. Reacher is always right. Um, Reacher might have to overcome things, but Reacher doesn't change. He rather dominates things by his worldview of, reluctant violence and power to solve problems, and the lauding of his special training as part of the military. So there's a Messiah vehicle in here. And again, I'm not judging what anybody wants to read or enjoy. That's not what this is about. This is about us understanding what it is we're writing. So if you have a Messiah vehicle who's unchanging, my question to you is going to be, what's the worldview you're championing to the reader? Because that's what this vehicle does. This vehicle takes on a worldview and champions that worldview to the reader. So if you have a Messiah vehicle that's unchanging, what is the worldview that Messiah vehicle keeps lining back on? So let's review real quick 5 types of vehicles. I'll have to go back to another slide to review this because I didn't make a slide with all 5 of them on it. That's a shame. 5 types of vehicles. Lead vehicles, 9 times out of 10, this is what we're going to write. Complex growth arcs, lots of scenes in their perspective. The reader's on an emotional journey with them. Supporting vehicles, we got to throw these in for whatever reason. We've got to have them. We need at least 2 scenes from their perspective, the start and the end. We need their conflict, choice, and consequences. They cannot just have one scene. You got to show them change a little bit, but that change can be simplistic and easy. Third-party vehicles look down on the plot as the narrator. They have already changed, and they're looking down, reflecting back on the way they've changed, and that's how the reader gets a satisfying growth arc from them. Chorus vehicles are a version of supporting vehicles where multiple characters act as a single character in the story. Messiah vehicles are these unchanging vehicles that represent a specific worldview. The reader isn't reading for the emotional journey of the Messiah vehicle. The reader is reading to feel victorious about the worldview. So I just want to pause a minute. I've talked about this a little bit throughout, but why is understanding your vehicle important? So again, you're like, Jeff, all these terms, what are you doing? Why do you keep talking in the third person in this podcast? I don't know. So, why is understanding your vehicle important? So, understanding the type of vehicle you're writing and how this vehicle is being used in your plot is going to help you diagnose issues in your story before readers find them. So, let me just run through a handful of examples off the top of my head. For example, if you've got one scene with one character in that character's perspective and you're like, this feels weird, when I plot this out, I have this abstraction scene. It means that you have a vehicle, but you haven't quite figured out how to use them yet. You need to figure that out. Are they part of a chorus? Are they a supporting vehicle that needs one more scene? Or is this a character that needs to become a lead vehicle that you've been ignoring? They're in the background of all these scenes, but you haven't actually thought about their growth arc, right? Like, where do they fall? You need to diagnose that beforehand. Maybe you have a character that doesn't change. You've got a vehicle that doesn't change, and you need to decide, are they a lead vehicle who needs to experience change through the story? Or am I writing a Messiah vehicle? And if I am, what worldview am I championing? Right? You got to know the difference. You got to understand what vehicle it is if you're really going to hammer home your story and what you're doing. Maybe you have a third party narrator, you really like their voice, but you're like, I don't know, they're kind of boring. Like the voice is fun for a couple chapters, but then it's just there. It's probably because you haven't figured out how that vehicle was changed by the story and why are they telling the story, right? What is it that they experienced in the story that impacted them? Why are they telling it? Understanding your third party vehicle and their growth arc that they are now at the end of is going to help you bring perspective to their voice and take the reader on a more satisfying journey. So understanding our tools empowers us to use them creatively. And this is just a quick note about tools again. All the dialoguers take a shot. When I was a blacksmith, I had a short stint as a blacksmith in college. When I was a blacksmith, we had a giant toolbox on the back of the truck. It had like 1,000 tools in it. I only knew how to use like two of them. The guy that I worked for, he knew how to use all of them. We'd come to a problem and he'd be like, go get this thing from the back. And I'd be like, what is that thing? And he'd be like, oh, it's the one that looks like this with the little knobby thing that twists. I'd go get it. He had mastered all these tools. Hit 2 seconds. What would have taken me 12 hours to do, he did in like 2 seconds because he knew the tool he needed and how to fix it. That's why we master tools. We master tools because they empower us to be more creative with the stories we're telling, right? If we know the tools, we know how to use them. We are empowered as we write to do things. So, and for me, that's what lifelong learning is about. I'm constantly want to be learning to create new tools, to create new ways for myself, new systems for myself, to solve problems that I don't even know I'm going to have yet. All right. I hope that this has been a valuable solo episode for you. It is very possible that I've missed a vehicle. Like I said, I've only been working on this problem for a couple months. Usually I work on them longer, but I felt like this one was kind of at a place where we could bring it up and start talking about it. If there's a vehicle I missed, please tell me. Come into dialoguedoctor.com. There's a little chat window that pops up. You can hit me there. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you can email me. The newsletter comes from my email, so you just email me back. Let me know if there's a vehicle I've missed. I want to know. And don't forget, the masterclass is on January 27th. I would love for you to join us. Writing intimate scenes. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, that is it for today. Go write something, get those words on the page, and I will see you again next week. Bye, y'all.